so much of life happens in the dark. I mean, I certainly know that creatively, right? I think probably all of us have experienced those seasons when the work suddenly feels like it's all uphill and we're stuck and everything feels challenging. And it's that period where the initial things that inspired us to even start the project, those voices aren't really talking to us anymore. And I've certainly experienced these dark moments spiritually as well, these dark nights of the soul in my relationship with God when I've gotten disoriented or I've gotten stuck and suddenly it feels like I can't hear the voice of God anymore. And I was in one of these seasons not too long ago. And even when I was in it, I didn't have words to describe it. Anything that I tried felt like it came up short. And if someone had even tried to speak truth to me in that situation, if they had said the things that we all know, like, don't worry, Nick, God works all things together for good. Or like that other tried and true of God knows the plans that he has for you. These things that are absolutely true, but in the moment they can just feel really trite, or they can even be damaging or painful, right? But I like to think that in that season, if I had stumbled across a film like this, maybe it could have named some of the things that I was feeling. Maybe it was something that I could have identified with. Maybe it even could have expressed some of those truths in a way that let me feel them rather than just know them. I think stories have this incredibly powerful way of helping us really know the truths we think we know. They help us feel the things we've taken for granted, and they help us experience tangibly the reality of God. My name is Nick Benoit. I am the creative director of a nonprofit called Braving Bird. And what we do at Braving Bird is we tell stories. We tell stories to help the curious experience the deep and hidden things of God. And then we give those stories away for free. We give them away for free to people like you, and to help you help the people that you serve to explore the deep and hidden things of God. But why exactly do we endeavor to do that through story in particular, right? I mean, why would we try to use stories to try to express the inexpressible things of God? So we all just got through the Easter season, right? My guess is based on this crowd of people, some of you are still putting the pieces of your lives back together. I hope that you have been able to get a little bit of rest after that season. But for me in my house, Easter morning, it's really, if we're being honest, it's really all about the Easter baskets. Never mind that my oldest, he's 15, and yet he and his sisters, they still just want their Easter baskets. So this Easter morning, before we were headed off to church, we were all sitting around to a really nutritious breakfast. My wife had gotten this cereal that was, it was Peeps cereal, which is horrifying. And it was also kind of delicious because it was basically Fruit Loops with marshmallows, and that just took me right back to childhood. But anyway, they're eating this awful breakfast, and they turned to me and my wife, and they're like, "So when are we doing Easter baskets?" And my wife is like, "Well, I mean, I guess we could do them now if you want." And they just looked at us with horror, and they're like, "Well, but you hid them, right?" And my wife and I look at each other, we're like, "No." And the disappointment on the faces of my three kids was so palpable. And here's why. A few years ago, we fell into this sort of unintentional tradition where the kids were little and we evidently had a lot of time on our hands. We were gluttons for punishment, and apparently we were better at this parenting thing. And so we created this whole elaborate scavenger hunt for the kids to find their Easter baskets. And there were all of these clues, and they had to traipse through the whole house and the yard, and it took them almost 30 minutes to find their Easter baskets the year that we did this, right? And it was 30 minutes of laughter and pleading and running and screaming, and it was kind of delightful. But it was also a ton of work on the part of their mother and I. And so every year after that, we have given this exercise just a little less effort than we did the year before. And every year, my kids have been just a little more disappointed in us as parents. And I think the reason that they're so disappointed in us is because discovery is a really powerful thing. To discover something is exciting, it's thrilling, it's fun, and it's even personally empowering. Because sure, they love that at the end of this whole adventure, there was a pile of chocolate and jelly beans and all that stuff. But even though what they found was good, the process of finding it was almost just as good. And I think the same thing is true about the most important things in life. We don't want to just be told them, we want to discover them. And I think stories act like the treasure maps of life. Instead of just being told, stories have the power to draw us into an adventure, one that is thrilling and fun and personally empowering. And in the end, they help us uncover these priceless treasures of truth. I think that's why our Bible is filled with stories. Tim Mackey of the Bible Project estimates that 43% of our Bible is narrative. That means almost half of the Bible is stories, which tells me that God must think stories are pretty good at communicating who he is, at communicating to us who we're meant to be, and revealing the things that have been hidden since the creation of the world, right? And of course, Jesus, he was telling stories all the time. Mark 4:34 says, he did not say anything to them without using a parable, which means every time Jesus spoke, he was telling stories. I mean, he must have thought they were pretty helpful. A third of the words that Jesus speaks in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are in the form of stories. And I think Jesus tells all of these stories because he's trying to make the inexplicable explainable. He's trying to make the profound graspable. I think sometimes when we're preparing messages, we have trouble trying to find room for stories. I mean, I know I do this. When we are getting ready for the weekend, we have so much we want to say, so many amazing things that we have discovered about God and about his kingdom. And we have so much that we want to share that we're like, how do I carve out time for stories? It just feels extraneous, right? And then there's Jesus. I mean, no one's ever heard a message like his. He has firsthand experience with the kingdom of God because he's been living there since before the dawn of time, right? And he's on a clock. He's got a short amount of time to share a whole lot. And yet he gives a third of his teaching time to telling stories. And that tells me that alongside facts about the kingdom of God, stories are an incredibly important and potent way to help people understand, feel, and experience the things of God. Joseph Campbell says it this way. He says, people forget facts, but they remember stories. Stories stick because they don't just make us think, they help us feel, they help us experience the things that are true. If you're not familiar with Joseph Campbell, he is the originator of what's called the hero's journey. And it's this articulation of the arc of many of the stories that the ones that we know and the ones that we tell. His Cliff Notes version of the hero's journey is this. A hero ventures forth. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Sounds like pretty much every movie we've ever seen, right? Basically, a hero leaves what he or she knows, enters into a whole new world, and wrestles with all kinds of forces in that world. The hero ultimately triumphs, returning from the brink of destruction, and then is able to give gifts that would have been impossible to give apart from the journey he or she has been on. In addition to all the movies we've ever seen, doesn't that sound like another story we're really familiar with? That just sounds like the story of Jesus to me. And Campbell articulates the hero's journey because of this larger overriding theory he has that he calls the monomyth. And the monomyth is, the theory of it basically says this: every story is really just a variation of one story. This one story that points to what humankind finds most valuable. Joseph Campbell imagines that every story is really just a derivative of one story, a story that reminds us of what we prize, what we long for, and the lives that we long to lead. And here's my question. Does the story of Jesus just happen to fit the pattern? Or does the pattern exist because of the story of Jesus? And I mean, we could make the argument that people have been telling stories that fit this pattern long before Jesus. But part of me just wonders if those were the voices in the wilderness making way for the story. For the story we were all waiting for. And now what if every story that we tell gets to point back to that one story? And we get to tell our fellow human beings that everything you long for in your own hero's journey is here and made possible by Jesus, the hero of every journey. Jesus didn't just tell stories. He was the story. He is the story. We tell stories because it helps us tell his story. But maybe I'm preaching to the choir, right? I mean, you probably wouldn't have signed up for a lunch and learn about storytelling if you weren't already a little convinced that stories are possible, or are possible and powerful. But, or maybe you just wanted free Chick-fil-A. I mean, that's no judgment. But I'm going to assume that most of us in this room want to tell more stories because we believe that they're powerful. We want more stories in the life of our church. And so if we want to tell more stories, why don't we? It's a lot of work. Telling stories is hard. Like that scavenger hunt that I made for my kids on Easter. It required a whole lot of effort on the part of my wife and I to give them an experience, to give them that gift of discovery. Telling good stories is hard in the best of circumstances, and most of us would probably readily agree that we don't always live and work in the best of circumstances. So I'm going to go through just a few of the challenges that we sometimes encounter in our church context. And if the challenges that you are facing don't fit into any of these categories, that's awesome. We're going to open it up for Q&A at the end. And so I'd love to be able to address those kinds of things, and you can be writing them down as I talk. But I think that the first challenge that many of us face is that the pace is fast. I mean, Sunday is always coming, right? It never stops. And a lot of us, we don't always have a great sense of exactly what might be coming, right? I mean, that message sometimes isn't taking shape until the week of, or we were told what it was going to be a couple months ago, but now we're actually like putting it into ProPresenter and it doesn't sound like what we were told it was going to sound like. And so suddenly we're just scrambling to keep up and trying to figure out how we're going to keep our teams caught up to what's going on. I remember one time I was working on a story to support a message, and the team and I had been writing and rehearsing for over a month. And the night before the service, I got a call from the pastor, and he said, "My message has totally changed direction." And I remember having to call every single one of those volunteers and tell them that everything they had been planning for, all the time that they had set aside for rehearsals, and for many of them, their first experience of getting to use their gifts for a purpose that they really believed in, it didn't seem to matter. The story was off. And I remember thinking, I don't ever want to do this again. We have to do this better. And it wasn't the first time that something like that had happened, and I knew that if I didn't do something different, it was going to happen again. It was about a month after that my wife and I went to a wedding, and it was a wedding of two of the loveliest and most creative people who have ever been in my life. And you pulled into this wedding, and what you were really driving into was this woods that was tucked into this valley. And when you got out of your car, you walked into the woods, and at the base of so many of these trees were these antique tables with antique typewriters on them. And you would type out a blessing for the couple. And then for the ceremony, we all spread out picnic blankets in a clearing in the woods and listened to their handwritten vows. And then to celebrate their first kiss, we cheered like crazy, and there was this chorus of banjos and accordions to celebrate their wedding. And then after that, we spent the entire afternoon playing games and stuff in the woods, and there were canoes that you could take out on the pond. And then that night, as it got dark, we danced under the light of thousands of lights that had been strung in the trees. It was one of the most magical experiences I've ever been a part of. And the food was terrible. It was barbecue. I'm usually a huge barbecue fan, but like half of it was cold, the other half was dry. But it didn't matter. If that event had been all about the food, if everything had been driving toward the food, maybe it would have mattered. But that day was about so much more. It was a celebration of this love. It was a celebration of the creativity of this couple. And that theme was celebrated in everything. And it was so beautiful that the food, it barely registered. It didn't even matter. And I think sometimes in our churches, we make the mistake of making everything about one thing. We elevate one gift above all the others. Everything in Planning Center is sort of leading up to this one 35-minute block, or 45-minute, or if we're talking like second or third service, it's like 55 minutes by that time. But when that one thing doesn't come together early enough, or it changes midstream, or has a week when it feels a little dry or a little cold, suddenly it feels like everything has fallen apart, right? That wedding taught me so much. It taught me that not everything has to work together perfectly for the thing to be pretty perfect. Every weekend, Jesus invites us to what is essentially the best wedding ever. And if the meal portion, for instance, of that wedding is maybe a little off from the rest, I think that's okay. For several years, I was creative director here at Willow. And during my time, our services had a few core ingredients that we were committed would be great. We would have a great message. We would have great music and worship. We would have great storytelling. Every single week, we were going after each one of those three things. And if we had also said that every thread of every one of those three things had to perfectly align, then it always would have meant that at least two of those categories were probably marking the weekend as a failure. Because each of those things works on a totally different timeline, right? I mean, that message often is coming together the week of. The music is maybe a couple weeks out. A lot of times the stories we were telling, that stuff was getting baked weeks, months out. They just don't work on the same timeline. And so we made the decision that the first half of our service, which was music and storytelling, maybe it didn't need to connect perfectly to the second half of our service. I mean, we liked it when it did. I mean, that was the ideal, right? Voltaire is the one who said, "The best is the enemy of the good." Sometimes, even though the best is when everything threads together perfectly, maybe sometimes we just got to go for good. At Willow, we didn't let the pursuit of best always rob us of the really good stories we were able to tell every single week. So don't give up on something good just because you can't do it perfectly. What I really wish on every one of those phone calls with the volunteers, what I really wish I could have said is, hey, so I just found out that the story we were going to tell this weekend, it doesn't attach to the message at all anymore. And we're going to tell it anyway. Because I believe God gave it to us. I believe it is ours to tell. And I believe he can do something with it. Because here's the thing, I don't think we're smart enough to perfectly program the one thing that the Spirit of God might want to communicate on a given weekend, right? So I think sometimes God is just asking us to bring our best. Bring the things that we were asked to bring. Bring a word, bring a song, bring a story or two, and then just trust the Spirit of God to do with that what he will. Because oftentimes we're moving too fast. But what if our problem isn't that we're moving too fast? What if our problem is that we just don't have enough money to work with, right? Because sometimes telling stories in the ways that we imagine them, it can be really expensive. It's true. But we need to reimagine them. I know that doesn't sound like rocket science, but sometimes we have to release the first version of an idea. A lot of times when I'm writing a script or I have a beginning nugget of an idea, I've learned that the first version that I have formed in my head is rarely the best version. I often surround myself with other people who speak into it, and a lot of times the way that they make it better is actually by simplifying it, by stripping it down, sometimes making it less expensive than the original idea. I think some of the best, some of the most moving, some of the most powerful stories that I've told have also been the least expensive. And here's the reality of it, stories are free. I mean, we all want a video or a big production, all the bells and whistles, all the magic, right? But not every story needs it. So a few years ago, researchers at Princeton did this study where they watched the brain of two people. One of them was telling a story and the other person was listening to a story. And what they saw in their brain activity is that the same parts of the brain lit up in both minds at almost exactly the same time. So the person telling the story, a certain part of their brain would activate, and a moment later, in the person hearing the story, their brain would activate. It meant that their minds were synchronizing. They were living fully immersed in this story together. And it was under the worst circumstances. All of this happened while they were slipped into MRI machines, these tiny tubes that make these crazy banging noises, and they've got headphones on, and they can't see one another, and their eyes are closed, and yet they're still sharing a story together in this deeply personal, intimate, powerful, connected kind of way. And what that tells me is that not every story needs bells and whistles. Not every story needs a budget. Sometimes we just got to stand on stage and tell the story we know to tell. And trust that it's going to resonate for the simple reason that I think human beings are built to connect to stories, even in their most humble forms. But what if you can't find the right story, or you're in a personal creative slump? We've all been there, right? Or you've got a planning meeting in a few hours, or the service is tomorrow. We have all scrolled through endless pages, right, of creative resources online. And sometimes it feels a little like perusing the rack at a thrift shop. You know, like you're going through 800 items of clothing to find that like one sweatshirt that maybe you would wear to a yoga class if you were sure no one you knew was going to it. Or maybe you have found those websites that it all feels like Lululemon. It's like, I would wear any of this. I cannot afford underwear here. And look, I don't just mean to be an infomercial, but that's one of the reasons that we started Braving Bird. We believe the story. We believe the church needs great stories. We believe that the church needs to capture the imaginations of people. And we want that to be for everybody. And so we make it free. We have really good stories and we make them free. Really good stories that dig into the mysteries of God for free. You can visit our website. You can search our ever-growing library of films by topic, by scripture, by holiday. And then you can download it all for free, and you can use it in services, small groups. You can use it online, wherever, whenever, for free. And I know this kind of sounds like a sales job, but I'm not even selling you anything. I'm just trying to give it to you. But let me give you a little bit of a look at some of our stories. Please use us. Tell your friends in other churches to use us, and then please tell us stories of how you used it and what impact it had, because that's what we do this for. Because we really do believe that stories can make a difference, that they can invite people into very real experiential encounters with God. They can create environments where people come face to face with him. And when that kind of thing happens, we want so badly to hear about it and to celebrate it with you. But what if you want to tell your own stories too? I think you should, at least every now and then. And the biggest problem maybe isn't time or money or hunting down the right resources. The thing that I hear most frequently from people is, I'm the only one. I'm the only advocate. I feel like I'm shouting all the time, and I'm the only person in the room who seems to understand how powerful stories can be. How in the world can I convince my pastor, my worship team, my small group leader to tell more stories? One really is the loneliest number. And if you're the only spokesperson and you feel like you might not be being heard, there might be a really good reason for it. Before you try to solve all the other issues that you surely see, make sure that you're not also the issue. Take a listen to your own voice. When you speak, what are you saying? How are you saying it? And what are you saying when you say nothing at all? I have had to learn some really hard lessons myself. Times when my reputation or my demeanor or my work ethic or my pride or all manner of other weaknesses of mine haven't exactly made me the best advocate for the things I'm most passionate about. And so here, I'm just going to give you a few quick lessons that I've had to learn, usually the hard way, about who I need to be to make the place I'm called to be all that I believe it can be. Here's the first. Number one, be a storyteller. I mean, that seems obvious, right? If you are an advocate for stories, you should be telling stories. But a few weeks ago, somebody from our marketing team came to me, and the idea was, let's create some YouTube content that helps people understand why stories are so important, right? And so I started writing this content, and I was editing the first couple drafts of it and realized I hadn't told any stories. Here I was advocating for why stories are so powerful, and I hadn't told a single story. And so I had to go back to the drawing board. Every meeting, every conversation, every brainstorm, every planning session is an opportunity for you to tell a story and thereby show the power stories can have. Sometimes the best argument you can make for why stories should be told is to tell one. The next one is to be trustworthy. To be a trusted voice in the conversation, you have to be trustworthy. And unfortunately, those of us who others might label creatives, well, we don't always excel in this area, right? Sometimes we make big promises and we deliver a little less than we promised. Or sometimes we look at deadlines as estimations, call times as suggestions. Sometimes we can get a little in our feelings and go a little off the rails, right? And sometimes it's not even us. Sometimes it was our predecessor, or sometimes it's just the stereotypes about us. And even if we are not the problem, solving it is our problem. We still have to work to change the perception. And so, if you want to be a trusted voice in the conversation, work very hard to be trustworthy. The next one is be strategic. If you get a chance, if you're finally given the opportunity, someone gives you a green light, don't feel like you have to go big the first time out. Under-promise, over-deliver. Go for clear rather than clever. Go for profound rather than highly produced. Go for moving rather than magical. Part of the amazing thing about stories is that they can connect with the mind and heart just by saying them. I mean, some of Jesus' stories, they were just a sentence or two, right? And we're still turning them over 2,000 years later. So when you finally get a chance to tell a story, start small, tell it simply, be strategic. And lastly, be brave. A lot of times our ideas for stories, the things that we feel have been entrusted to us to give away, they kind of feel precious, right? They kind of feel like a part of us. We wrap them up in our identities, and it can be really scary to share them, to open those things up for judgment to other people. There was a season I was a creative director for a church in California, and I had this slump of a creative season. It felt like I didn't have any ideas left. And I walked in the door one morning, and we had a weekend planning meeting in about an hour. And I felt so much self-disgust because I had been going to this meeting for probably the last month and a half and had not brought a creative idea to the table in all of that time. And I was like, I've got creative in my title. I should probably be someone bringing an idea to the meeting, right? And so chastising myself, I just sat down and I'm like, I'm just gonna start to write. And it was crazy. Suddenly I got into that wonderful flow state, that time when things just seem to be working and time sort of disappears. And in fact, time sort of did disappear because I look up and I'm already late for the meeting. And I look down at this draft that I'm writing, and I didn't know it at the time because I'd never written one. But what I had been really writing, suddenly it had this like rhythm and rhyme to it. And it was the beginnings of a spoken word, but I'd never written anything like it in my life. But I had this like half-finished draft. I'm running down the hall to the meeting, and I burst through the door, and everybody else is already there. And so I already feel awkward. I'm breathing heavily in the corner. There's like a little bit of sweat. It's gross. And I sit down, and all I want to do is hide because I've got this like what now feels like this very precious thing I'm holding. And it felt really good to be creative again. It felt really good to write it. And I was afraid that if I shared it, it wasn't going to feel good anymore because suddenly it was open for judgment. It was open to the opinions of other people. And so I sat there and I just warred within myself, like, you should bring it up. You should say something. No, you definitely shouldn't do that. Until finally we got to the very end of the meeting. I mean, they are closing this thing down in prayer. Someone says, if there's nothing else, all right, then I'll pray. And then there's that classic like inhale right before someone prays, right? And they go, and I just blurt out, I've got something. And everyone just sort of awkwardly looks up from prayer. And I started to read this half-written draft. That moment changed everything for me. In that moment, I discovered that God had given me a gift to do something I'd never tried to do before. In that moment, God gave me a way to write that later on in life would often become prayer for me. It gave me a way to write that would sometimes get me unstuck, a way to write that would express myself to God and to the world. It opened up so much. It became words that would mark moments in our church time and time again. And I think about that moment all the time because it could have turned out so differently. Because I could have just kept it to myself. I could have stayed quiet and I could have stayed really safe and it could have felt good just for me. But I couldn't escape this feeling that those words weren't even mine. But that I was now responsible for them somehow. I'd been entrusted with something. I think telling the stories that have been entrusted to us so often is not necessarily an act of inspiration, it's an act of obedience. But to follow through with that, we might have to be really brave with our ideas.